Hey everybody, and welcome to another instalment of board games I got rid of and why. So this is a series where I talk about a bunch of board games that I've previously owned but for one reason or another no longer do. And I tried to give some rationale as to why I came to the decision to part with them. Before I get started on these 10 games, I want to give a shout out to the show's sponsor, KIENDA.co.uk, who are my go-to online retailer here in the UK. And if you use my link in the show notes or the QR code, then you can get 5% off your first order. But let's get on with the games. So the first game I'm talking about is Emerald, which is one of the earliest designs by prolific designer Rudiger Dorn, who just so happens to be one of my favourite designers and has made some of my favourite games, including Istanbul and Las Vegas Royale. But Emerald was a borderline kids game, not much decisions to be had here. And essentially it has a very simple movement mechanism as you have multiple pawns. And depending on the amount of people on the spot that one of your pawns is on, you're going to move that many spaces. So if there's 4 people here, you can take 4 steps. And of course, the next person could only take 3 steps because there's only 3 people on that space now. And you're going to use that mechanism in order to charge into this cave, trying to pick up treasure, but trying to avoid this dragon piece that's moving up and down this row. And if it lands on you, it's going to cost you your treasure and potentially send you back to the start. So a very entry-level game. In fact, I wouldn't even call it entry-level. I'd call it, basically a children's game. So the decisions weren't quite there. It was quite a charming production. It looked like an old throwback. Yeah, but ultimately the decisions were lacking, and it was, a kid's game. So ultimately it wasn't going to stay in my collection. So that is Emerald. The second game I'm talking about is Metropolis, which is an old school Euro published by Istari. Now, Istari used to be a great publisher who brought out some amazing games, some of my favourites actually. And Metropolis was one that I'm kind of on the fence with. I did like it a lot, but not quite enough to keep. And I think a big factor of that is because one of the key mechanisms in the game is kind of bidding, I suppose. I have a lot of bidding games, so in order to stay around in my collection now, and to be a bidding game, you have to be very special. Now, I did like the way that this game handled bidding. Did it in a completely different way, because basically you'd have this big map of these islands, and all these islands would be divided up into different sections. And what you do is you basically put one of your skyscrapers down on one of these spots to say, this is what I'm willing to bid for this particular spot. And all these skyscrapers are going to come in a unique number. I think it's ranging from, say, 1 or 0 all the way up to 13. But once you spent it, you spent it. But if somebody, say, bids a 7 and somebody wants to outbid it to an 8 or above, then you don't actually replace the spot that you're on. You actually go to an adjacent spot. So you're always kind of spreading. And the place you're bidding for is moving as the round progresses, which I thought was a very cool touch, and I've never seen that before. Now, I love that unique mechanism, and again, this is what I was very much on the fence with. But the issue I had with this game was the fact that one of the main ways you get points is by these hidden objectives. And from my perception, these hidden objectives didn't seem terribly balanced. Some of them seemed a lot easier than others to achieve, and some of them, you had to work a lot harder than the other ones. So that didn't quite sit well with me. Now, I am aware that this game has been re-implemented as a game called Skyrise, so I'd be very interested to see what changes have been made, because I wanted to keep the simplicity and elegance of this game, because it was very clever. But yeah, that balancing was a little bit off for me, so hopefully that's been fixed without too much convolution. So yeah, I'll keep my eyes peeled for Skyrise to see if this was going to reappear on my kind of radar and if I want to get it played again. So that is Metropolis, definitely a near miss. The next game I'm talking about is Glasgow, which is a small box 2-player game, and it's a little tile placement game as you're building up this city of Glasgow by placing tiles, but you're doing that communally, so you and the other player are both placing in the same grid essentially, and when you place things you're going to score points based on what these tiles do. Some of them might want to be next to certain buildings, some of them will score if they're on the corners, that kind of thing. You've seen a lot of games that do this, but I like the fact that you are sharing a grid in this one. But the way the actions play out is that you're moving around this rondelle essentially, and it's like a time track. Someone will keep taking turns until they catch up with the other player. That's generally a mechanism I like. So yeah, on paper, this one did have a lot of things I liked. It was quite a charming little game, nice and fast, some relatively interesting decisions, but ultimately I felt like there are other games that do it better. I felt like it was somewhat forgettable, and it was like, you know, once you've played this a couple of times, you don't really need to play it anymore because you've seen what all the tiles do. You're probably going to do the same thing each time, and I found a lot of the decisions relatively obvious on what you should be going for. So yeah, unfortunately, again, I like the way how smooth this game was and, you know, how streamlined it was, but yeah, the decisions need to be there for it to stick around, and I thought this one just almost played itself at times. The next game I'm talking about is Crystal Palace, which undoubtedly is the heaviest game on this list, an advanced strategy game for sure. And this is a dice-driven Euro, as you are placing dice on the board in a worker placement manner. However, you as the player get to choose the pip values of the dice. Higher values are going to be great because they're going to give you access to better actions and allow you to break ties with other players. However, the bigger the value on the dice, it means the more money you have to spend. And money in this game is so tight. This might be one of the tightest money management games I've ever played. Very hard to manage your funds. You're basically doing a bunch of different things, you know, climbing tracks, getting powers, you can, you know, get these inventions, getting points, and you can assign characters to them to get more points. Tons to be done here, lots of Euro goodness, but it all tied back to that dice mechanism, which I think was fantastic. I love the way that worked, and I love the way you'd actually do it simultaneously, you know, behind a screen and reveal them, meaning that, you know what, I went for all high numbers, you went for all low numbers, which means that I've probably wasted some money there because I could have gone lower and still beat you to the punch. So yeah, that was really interesting, and in fact I love that mechanism, and I'm surprised I've not seen it again since. However, it did result in some very analytical decisions. If you are AP prone, then you're going to find this game a big struggle because you have to very meticulously plan things out. What are you willing to go for? What are you willing to spend? How much have you got? How much can you get as income? And yeah, very brain burnery. And I did like the game a lot. I did give this one my shield of quality at the time, and I still do. I'll probably rate it about a 7.5 out of 10. But the issue is that because this game is so heavy, and you're looking at around 2 hours play, maybe more than that, I'm probably not going to get it from the shelf often, if ever, because ultimately I have dice-driven games that are quicker, that are more mid-weight, and that I prefer to Crystal Palace. So therefore it's kind of struggled to find its place in my collection. So yeah, if you do enjoy very advanced games and you like that brain-burning nature, check this one out. But I do think there are better games out there, such as some of the ones over my shoulder here. And if I'm looking for a very heavy game, or if I'm going to pull out a 2-3 hour game off the shelf, then there's other ones I'm going to lean towards before this one. So therefore, it had to go. The next game I'm talking about is Atlant Dice. So not only does this game have one of the worst names I've ever heard, this was an awful game, and I can barely remember how it functioned, but I remember hating it. It's a dice-driven area majority game. It kind of felt like a very awful version of something like Las Vegas Royale. Very swingy, very random, next to no agency, and just an absolute mess. So just avoid at all costs. That is Atlant Dice. The next game I'm talking about is Valletta by Stefan Dora, another great designer who's made some fantastic games such as For Sale and Pergamon. And this is a medium lightweight Euro with a deck building element to it and some resource management as you are playing through cards, getting resources and money, using those resources to build buildings that are already established on the board or on the table. And when you're building these buildings, you are getting the card on them and adding them into your deck. Now, you get points for building these buildings, and you'd also get discounts for building adjacent buildings to the ones you've already established. And for me, that was one of the issues I had with the game, because it would almost lead you down a path where you have such a strong incentive to build next to your existing buildings, where you're always going to do that. At least that's what I found the way the game played. It was quite a smooth game. You could manage your deck quite cleverly, and I like the way that at the end of the game you could play through every single card you've collected to give you that extra satisfaction and pay out of your investment. But yeah, ultimately this is another one where once you've played it a couple of times, you've seen everything. It's certainly on the smaller scale of a deck builder. You're not going to have tons of cards to manage and have tons of different ones. They're kind of like basic versions and then slightly improved versions. So again, this one certainly has a glass ceiling for what you're going to get out of it. But a nice intro game, but you're probably going to move on from it pretty quickly. And I played this one quite a bit after I played much more satisfying, involved games. So maybe it just wasn't in the right kind of priority in which I played this one. But check out my review if you're interested. It's a nice game, and again, nice introduction to some Euro mechanisms, but ultimately there's better ones out there that just have a bit more going on. The next game I'm talking about is Hadrian's Wall, which is a grandiose flip and write style game, certainly the heaviest one I've ever played, where you're going to have 2 sheets full of tracks and boxes to tick off. And this game has the whole combo-rific nature of flip and write style games that you love to see. You know, you do one thing that triggers another thing that triggers another thing. You can string off some amazing, big, powerful turns that feels great and satisfying. This game had that in spades, but I do feel there was this weird jarring sensation where, being a flip and write style game, you know, they normally skew on the simpler side of things. You like them to be just like, you know, quick, get them out on the table, get them played, you know, rip off the sheet, throw it in the bin, and you're done. This one took around an hour to play, which is certainly a step above all the other ones I've played. And additionally, this game had like physical resources. You had, you know, your resources, you had meeples, you had cards, and all that seemed to detract away from the simplistic nature that a flip and write style game should be. So it felt like a full board game experience, or at least in the production and the scale and setup and teardown time, but you were just ticking off boxes. So it felt a little bit weird, and I felt like you could play 2 simpler, more streamlined roll and write style games or flip and write style games in the time you could play this one and feel equally as satisfying, because although this was huge in scale, it was more wide than it was deep, if that made sense. So you do one thing that wouldn't really affect another thing, where in reality you could play, you know, 3 other simple roll and write style games that are equally as fun and equally as combo-rific. So I did like the game quite a lot. I just felt like I really struggled to pull this one off the shelf before I do the other ones. And you know, if I want something where I'm going to, again, just tick some boxes off, I'm going to play something that takes 10-15 minutes rather than something that takes an hour. So therefore, again, Hadrian's Wall wasn't going to find its place on my shelf. Again, I did like it, and I certainly would play it again, but I didn't want to own it because I just knew it wouldn't get played. So that is Hadrian's Wall. The next game I'm talking about is Yokohama, which is a game I searched high and low for a very long time, because I heard a lot of good praise and I got a lot of good things about this game. And it has a lot of shared DNA with one of my favourite games called Istanbul, which I've already mentioned on this episode, where you are, it has the core mechanism is the same, where you have a bunch of your pieces and then you can drop them off on these different tiles as you go, and the space you end on is the action you take. Now, I love Istanbul. I think it's got a great balance of being involved in decisions and yet being simple. Yokohama wasn't terribly complex, but it was a step above something like Istanbul, where you are more invested in these spots, getting more payout the more you go there. Get a little bit more going on, a kind of step above, as I said. And I don't think those extra things added to the experience. I actually do prefer Istanbul to this one, and because this one is more involved, it's going to take more of a teach. It's going to be a little bit longer. I just knew it wasn't going to get played. So if I had a game that can be directly compared to another one, I'm going to choose one over the other, because I get the full experience with the faster game and the simpler, more streamlined version. So I'm probably in the minority there. I know a lot of people who have played Yokohama prefer Yokohama, but personally I don't. But again, I don't want to make that sound negative, because I think that Yokohama is a solid design. I did enjoy it a lot. Again, it still has my recommendation. But yeah, another game that's been replaced by something else, therefore its kind of position has been void, essentially. So that is Yokohama. The next game I'm talking about is Peep Mats, which is a small box card game designed by Ben Pinchback and Matt Riddle, who are 2 of my favourite card game designers. Made some fantastic games like Sebastral and Stella. So I was very excited to try Peep Mats, actually, because not only did it have the designer pedigree, but it has some gorgeous artwork and a very charming visual look of this game. And it has some pretty quirky mechanisms, as you'd have this kind of stack of these seed cards, and what you'd be doing is you'd be playing these birds on either side of this perch, and depending on the values you played, it would determine the seeds you take. And the seeds are going to be one way of gaining points, but you're also trying to collect these pairs of birds of the sexes, so you've got the male and female birds, and for each pair you get a certain amount of points. And you'd have to kind of be careful of the opportunities you leave to other players. So it did have this kind of nice flow to it. It had this weird nature. It did feel different. But this game had a mechanism that I really did not like, and that was the idea that you could obtain these, I think it was squirrel and blackbird cards, which would have this horrible, not take that nature, but almost take that nature, but the game would hit you and essentially randomly take cards from your hand. You'd have to lose cards from your collections. And it felt like very swingy at times because these seeds come in different values. And if you keep on taking these blackbird cards and they kept on taking your 3-point values, then that's going to hit you so much harder than if they only take your 1-point values. So it didn't quite sit right with me where you could, meticulously plan things out, then all of a sudden you could do nothing about losing 3 points. So yeah, I did not like the way that worked. That was probably the only thing I didn't like about it actually. But I do think there's some better card games out there, some of the ones I've already mentioned, and that extra negative mechanism just pushed it over the edge for me. So despite being a tiny box game, it just wasn't quite for me. And the final game I'm talking about this episode is Curious Cargo, which is another 2-player only game. And this game certainly is a brain burner as you're trying to build this network of pipes on your personal player board. And they can come in 2 or 3 different colours depending on the difficulty you want to play. I mean, I'd recommend 2, that's complex enough. And then you're trying to build this network of pipes, making them touch the parameters or the edges of your board to load up these trucks, essentially. And then when you load up these trucks, you're going to send them off to your player's board, your opponent's board, because your board and your opponent's board actually touch back to back. And then they can try and almost bring in your resources to get points that way. So you kind of have to be careful about where you're pushing these lorries along and to make sure you're not leaving your resources to be sucked in by your opponent, and you're doing the same vice versa. But you're constantly just laying these tiles out, you can overlap them, and you're constantly changing your network because you can't stay static and everything's always in flux. And it's certainly one of those games where you do one thing, it's going to change another thing, it's going to change another thing, and it becomes quite a frustrating exercise, but again, takes the whole puzzle nature of these games to a new level. And I think for the right person, they're going to get a lot from this. For a 2-player game, it does take around an hour to play, maybe even a little bit longer, which is kind of above my comfort level or what I generally do. If I'm going to play a 2-player only game, I'm probably looking at around half an hour, because if I am going to play a longer 2-player game at 2 players, I'm probably going to play a multiplayer game but at 2 players, if that makes sense. But yeah, this one was a weird niche because it did feel like it was certainly crunchy. You had probably a game or 2 to get things out of your system to try and play optimally. You're going to make a lot of mistakes. The turn structure was a little bit weird, but again, I liked it. I liked the, I quite liked the brain burner nature of it, but at times it did feel like work and more than fun, if that makes sense. So yeah, a strange one for me. One that again was certainly on that border of, was I going to keep it, was I not going to keep it? But since passing on with this one, or since moving this one on, I've certainly not regretted it or missed it, if that makes sense. So that is Curious Cargo. So there we have it. Those are another 10 board games that I've left my collection. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video. If you have, please be sure to hit like and subscribe to my channel and check out my other content too. For everybody else, I'll see you next time on Chairman of the Board. Bye bye.